Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Back to Out with Dan. Today, I'm excited to talk to Chris Offutt about The Reluctant Sheriff. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. Chris is the author of 2 collections of short stories, 3 memoirs, 6 novels. You were a writer on True Blood, Weeds, Treme. You've won a Pushcart Prize, an NEA grant, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. You've been a busy fella, Chris.
Well, I've been at it for a long time, so.
So how did you get into screenwriting? Before we get to The Reluctant Sheriff,
just a fluke, really. There's a writer, a buddy of mine named George Pelicanos, who is a real good writer. Writes about where he grew up and still lives in Baltimore. And he had been asked to write a screenplay, and he didn't have time. And he knew that I was, broke. And so he gave him my name, and these brothers called me and said, would like you to write a pilot. And I knew if they were cold calling me, they were at the end of their rope, and I said yes to everything.
If you're going to get into screenwriting, that's probably the way to go, because they don't like much pushback. So.
No, it was luck. It was a lucky break, and then I learned a lot. I wasn't real good at it. I'd never done it. They're extremely hard, Dan. Harder than I thought. I've talked to so many writers since, novelists, who just couldn't do it and felt like, wow, there's a trick to it. Like, how does do it, Chris? And I said, I don't know. If I hadn't needed the money so badly, I don't think I would have embarked upon it. So that's how I got into it. And then one thing led to another, and I developed a skill and enjoyed it, actually. And especially writing pilots. That's more fun.
Yes, because I think there you get to create a world, and that's a good thing.
That's right. The successful television writer on a staff show is really good at copying the style of the person who created the pilot. Which is an unusual skill, very difficult, one I wasn't so well suited for. I was always trying to add stuff, but you really need to duplicate the world that's been created. And so writing pilots, I wrote a bunch of them because they paid more.
Well, we always like that.
And B, I didn't have to necessarily be in LA. I was going back and forth and renting, places, and it was costing me money, and renting a car, which I would scrape up against objects. LA's got a lot of stuff laying there waiting for a car to bump into it.
That's right. We've got all kinds of obstacles at all times.
Well, that's how I got into it.
Oh, that's wonderful. So let's talk about The Reluctant Sheriff. Can you give the audience an overview of what this is about?
I'm not sure if I can. You might be better suited to it. Let's see. What's it about? The guy is reluctant because Mick Hardin he's recently retired from the military, where he was a homicide investigator within the Army. And I just chose that because I thought it would be the toughest job in the world to have to try to investigate young men at the prime of their, physical prowess, who also have been trained to kill. So I thought, okay, you got to be pretty, tougher than me to do that. So he's back in Kentucky, and his sister has been is recovering from being hurt in the line of duty, and he's just holding his sister is the first female sheriff in county history. And there's a lot of people who don't like that, the men, the patriarchy. Even some of the women are suspicious. So he has agreed to be an acting sheriff in order to keep that position alive, or else, the city fathers or whatever will appoint their own man in there. So he's a reluctant sheriff, and there's a homicide at the beginning, and which is how I started all these books. Like, okay, here's like all the British television shows. It's usually a dog walker on the
That's right. That's
who,
right.
Who found the body? A dog walker.
Walker, right?
Dog walker.
It does seem like there's a lot of bodies that are dropped just for somebody who's walking a dog to find along the way.
Or there's a lot of dog walking in England.
One of the other.
Like in the hills of Kentucky, nobody walks their dogs. They're just out there running around. So.
That's right. They might bring the body back with them.
or parts of it.
Parts of it. That's right. So did you grow up in Eastern Kentucky?
Yeah, I grew up in a little community of 200 people that was just dirt roads and creeks and woods. It was in the Daniel Boone National Forest, surrounded by it. I walked like a footpath through the woods to get to school, which was like probably a half mile shorter than following the dirt road. Just take a shortcut through the woods, and yeah, that's where I grew up. It was just literally in the woods. So
that you grew up in a smaller place than I did. There were maybe 400 people in the little village I grew up in.
Yeah.
But we had a crossroads, but no traffic light. We had a flashing light. But that whole country thing it's a very different world than say what you experience here in Los Angeles. So is there a reason? I know it's because you're from there, but is there a real reason that you wanted to set the novels there? Or was it just because that's where you're from?
I think it's a combination of a few things. First of all, when I first started writing, when I was in my late 20s, I was over 40 years ago. And I thought, well, before that, I'd been writing stuff set in Victorian England, or Africa, or some exotic places. And then when I got serious in my late 20s and started reading and realized, I'm from a world that I didn't know was unique till I left. And then I thought I'll read all the literature from the area. And as it turns out, Dan, there wasn't much.
Mm-mm.
There were only 2 writers, maybe 2.5, from the hills of Kentucky. And one was really good. And his best book was set in the 1930s.
Wow.
James Still. And I expanded to Tennessee and the Carolina, and there just wasn't many. And I kind of made this vow to myself then. Like, I was disappointed and thought, wow, how could this be? There's hundreds of books, tens of thousands, and writers just aren't coming out of here. So I thought, well, so I wound up reading a lot of marginal writers from other marginalized worlds, because that's essentially what Appalachia is, and realized that there was a lot in common, whether we were talking about Latino writers or Black writers or Native writers, right? The domestic problems were pretty much across the boards when you come to oppression and poverty and unemployment, et cetera, bad education. So that was where I found my source for reading. And I decided that I would try my best. And this is youthful, like, ridiculousness, really, to try to create a literature for future writers who would not be in the boat that I was in for when I was in my 20s. And that's why I set everything there. And I think, and writers have come along from the region, and that's good. And they've been in contact with me, and I've been very supportive and all. So that's that's probably the biggest reason. The other is, frankly, I miss the land and the culture, and I miss the way people think. There's, and so when I write, it's a way to kind of address a sense of deep internal homesickness by just going back home.
And Chris and I talked before we started recording about the fact that since I'm from North Carolina, Kentucky is so southern.
Yeah.
If you look at it on the map, you would almost think perhaps it skews northern, but it doesn't. It's very southern for sure. And I do think that Chris and I both agree that Southerners often have a very descriptive way of language. And I think you just now touched on also, we're a different group of people. We're neither better or worse than, we're simply different than. And I find that there's something comforting when I go home to Eastern North Carolina, because that's where I'm originally from. That's where I was born and bred. And there is that type of language or just way of thinking. I remember there are issues everywhere in the world, but I remember there was some what I call just simple everyday kindness when I was growing up. Everybody was in everybody's business, but there was a bit of kindness to it in the fact that they weren't taking to social media to lambast all the neighbors.
Right.
If a neighbor needed some help, they got some help from someone, which is, I think it's nice to be invisible in Los Angeles, but I do miss that some.
Well, yeah, I think that you can be, two families can be enemies, and the young people don't even know why. They just know they're supposed to be, and so they are. But if your so-called enemy is, his car is off in the ditch, you're going to stop.
That's it. Absolutely. It's just a very different part of the world and the way we think. So I'm curious about something. I felt as if in this book there was a lot of searching for what I might call Zen and self-reflection. Was that something you set out to purposefully include? No. Oh, come on, Chris. Tell everybody that was your goal.
No. I never have a goal. I just start writing. I didn't know, at a certain point there was, I think maybe 2 dead bodies. I didn't know who killed them. I didn't know why. I didn't know what was going on. I was just sticking with Mick, and Mick is a stand-in for me on an emotional and highly personal basis. I mean, I'm not a combat hardened paratrooper, like Mick is, but I think that as I've written more and more of these books, he has grown to reflect more of my own, whatever I'm going through at the time. And that year was difficult. The last year when I wrote that book, year and maybe 2 years, was a very hard time. And I, if it comes off like Zen, he is searching for Zen. That was just me in my own way trying to find some peace and solace. I tell you one thing I thought was interesting was I saw my publicist sent me a review. I refuse to read reviews, but he sent me a excerpt of one. It said that Mick Hardin is having a midlife crisis. And I thought, wow. I mean, he's about the right age. And maybe that was in there, and I didn't know it. And then there was another one, the reference. Somebody asked me, "Did he have PTSD?" And I thought, well, maybe. And now it's Zen. So it's getting.
Well, I guess So that's a great thing about a good book. It speaks to each of us differently. But I really want to sort of get into a little bit of why it spoke to me on a Zen related level.
Yeah.
And so you take a character like Johnny Boy, who goes to a foreign land, and he's kept, so to speak, for a reason by someone who becomes his mentor and his keeper and his trainer. And one of the things about Sebastian is he moves like the wind. You don't always hear him or see him. He simply appears. And so in Johnny Boy's relationship with Sebastian, he tries to emulate that. But I kept feeling as if he wasn't trying to emulating necessarily to fit in, but to just realize what made him so good at fluid movement.
Yeah.
And I think so. Mick does the same with his sister Linda. I mean, when you are the sheriff, you're the reluctant sheriff in this instance. He's trying to bring some peace and normality to a world that isn't his world. And so there, I think, once again, he's in a bit of conflict, yet he brings a Zen-like movement to his even in the fight scene towards the end of the book. It is so important, his movement in the woods. And I thought to myself, when we walk in the woods, we have an opportunity to be one with nature, or we can fight against it.
Right.
Mick seems to take a delight in getting along with nature.
He does, as do I. And I think that there's, in addition to what you said, you go along with it or fight against it, there's another element that's a huge factor for most people, which is fear.
Yes.
People are afraid of the woods, and because the majority of Americans grow up in cities and small towns, or suburbs and cities and big, small. But the woods are scary places in our entire mythology, going back to, the fairy tales we read as a child. There's always something bad in the woods. Our movies are, scary shit happens in the woods. Sorry, am I allowed to say that?
You may say whatever you want, Chris. This is a free community here.
So that is another big factor for a lot of people, and that I've never afraid of the woods. I always felt more comfortable in the woods than, damn near anywhere else. So when Mick goes into the woods in the book, he often goes in by himself, and then it's just a way for me to realign myself with that part of my mind and reimagine and imagine myself in the woods with it. And if it approaches, I think what you're saying is Sebastian moves in a fluid motion, but like physically, whereas you're suggesting that Mick is the way he interacts with people, not so much like his actual physical gait and walking. So I mean, it's accidental, but it's also the best, the part of writing that I like the most is when I can get him into the woods by himself.
I liked it. I mean, I liked it. And you could feel the comfort level that he has with it, that obviously you have with it as well. Because I do think as a writer, you bring these things to life in a book. So one of the compliments you get a lot of is your prose writing. And I want to mention two things. I write notes down because God help me if I had to remember anything. Something was described as lonely as the last leaf on a tree in winter. It is so descriptive, but it is so perfect. It spoke of loneliness. And I think loneliness was another theme of this book that I picked up on. Besides Zen, I thought that a loneliness was felt by so many of your characters. And then how do you deal with that loneliness? And they each, of course, brought their own way of handling it to the page.
I mean, I think that Johnny Boy is probably the most truly lonely because he's never been out of, his home county, and suddenly he's on an island in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean without speaking the language. And those, they were difficult to write because nothing happens and he is limited to his interactions. So the loneliness came through. I think I'm a lonely person in general. In the past couple of years have been even more so. I think it's writers are often, we work alone. I don't meet people through my job. Who am I going to meet? My dog,
right?
So I also believe that we are in a lonely era and have been since entering COVID. The lockdown just produced a tremendous amount of loneliness, and And so it doesn't surprise me what you're saying that it's in there. Mick is. I realized after somebody else mentioned loneliness, and then pointed out to me, somebody I was talking to had read them all, who pointed out to me that none of the people in the books have a partner. Johnny Boy, Mick, Linda, those are the main. Now there's a new main guy, Ray, and he does have a partner, but he's a newer addition. I think he came into the second or third book. So, and that was accidental too, So if you just got people who are alone a lot, you're gonna maybe the loneliness comes through.
Well, I think so. And I think that loneliness seems to be an emotion that a lot of authors don't tackle. I think it's because, I think most readers would like a happy ending. In a murder mystery, we're going to have a solving of what goes on.
Right.
And in some ways, if you're a big murder mystery fan or a thriller fan, you get your happy ending because there's a resolution. If you read a romance, you get a happy ending because that's what romance novels do. But I think the emotion of loneliness is something that every human feels at some point in their life. And yet I don't find that very many authors tackle it. So I thought you did such a good job at that. But it's not a dark and depressing novel. I mean, you just give us human life. And that's the beauty of your writing, Chris.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's the goal, is to try to present the culture of the hills of Kentucky as I see it, in warts and all, but at the same time show human beings at their best and their worst. And loneliness is, we're the world that we're occupying now and have been for a while creates a loneliness for people and I think that the social media, frankly, contributes to the loneliness. It's like a bad Band-Aid for social interaction. And it fosters it. And you can spend, whatever, an hour on looking at the social media pages, or 2 hours or 3, and then just feel awful afterwards. So I quit doing that.
Well, I mean, I don't love you because I think, look, I go out to eat a lot and go out drinking and stuff. And so I post pictures of martinis and steaks. Right. It looks as if I have a very opulent life. I think I have a very normal life, but I don't show me vacuuming and doing the laundry because nobody really wants to see that. We all want to aspire to something. But I think that I agree with you. I think social media causes immense loneliness because we're not together. We're separate. We're just being a voyeur to someone else's life.
Well, and we think it's like a stand-in for genuine being with somebody. But I was thinking about this also with Zoom. Like Zoom is we're on Zoom or whatever this is called, a version of it. Right. And it's better than a phone. And it's certainly better than an email interview, which is no more than a essay contest.
Right.
But it's still not as good as if you and I were sitting at a table and you were photographing our martinis.
That's right.
And we were able to read the physical and expressions and body language and all. It's still not quite as good, but it's better than the phone, I suppose.
I agree with you. I think there's both a distance and a beauty to being able to see each other.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing, but there is a distance because we are 2 time zones away from each other. And when you have a interaction physically with someone else, you do read their emotions, you feel them, you see it, and you can have a different kind of conversation.
Right.
So I just absolutely loved The Reluctant Sheriff. Chris, what's next for you?
Well, that's book 4 in what I would call an accidental series, which I started during lockdown and didn't intend to. I just thought it would be one book. And I'm working now on another book. I started a book about moving back to Iowa, this is the fourth time I've moved to Iowa, which is sort of, I just moved to the same places over and over. New York twice, Boston once, Florida, Kentucky 4 times, Montana twice, New Mexico twice, California 3 times. It's a ridiculous way of living a life, but it seems to be how I've conducted mine.
That's all right. That's
so
all right.
I started a book about moving back and got real lonely and gave it up. And then I started another book about set in Kentucky, about a young house painter. I just wanted to write something different. I wanted to write about a younger person, and then started working on another Mick novel. So at this point, I've got over 100 pages of 2 different novels, and I'm considering. It occurred to me that I could actually bring them together.
Okay.
Possibly. So that's what I'm doing. It's what's next for the world. For me, it's just what's next is, turning on the computer in the morning and I really try to occupy the moment as much as possible. I never reread afterwards. So it doesn't occur to me. I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know you said, is this planned or something, or is it deliberate? Like, no, it'd be impossible for me to do it because I don't know what I just did. The next morning, it's like, and this morning I look at where he is. Mick was in the woods, of course. Running around in the woods, so I was like, great, I'm going to go take a little walk and then, and stare out the window at the trees and
find out what comes next. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being a guest, Chris. I've had a great deal of fun.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate you having me, and yeah, it was a pleasure. I like that painting too. I guess this is off the record since you can't sit.
Thank you very much.
Really nice.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.